Thanks, Marcelo, for coming on the line with me. Before we dive into coronavirus, why don't you tell us very briefly a little bit about yourself, where you are, who you are?
Thank you, Guy. Thanks for having me on your show. I hope this becomes a show. I am in Miami, Florida, and very excited to talk to you about the coronavirus and other topics.
Yeah, but just for so he's being reticent. Marcelo runs an investment partnership. I got to know Marcelo maybe 20 years ago when a mutual friend sent him to me and I invited him over for dinner. And it's been really fun and interesting to follow your progress, Marcelo. And I would say that something I've noticed over the last 2 or 3 years is how you've become perhaps the most sophisticated user of Twitter that I've ever seen. And I'm actually really curious also to see how your understanding of the technology world has grown, coming from a value investing perspective where all one looks at is hard assets. I have a strong sense that you have a very good understanding of some of the newer kind of assets, like the value of cloud computing or the value of networks and different kinds of network effects. But that's not what we're going to get into right now. You've become increasingly strident in the Twitter sphere on how we're responding to the coronavirus. And I just want to give you a chance to just tell it like it is.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Guy. I fondly remember the first time I met you and we paced alongside Central Park and you took me to your house for dinner and your wife was like, who is this guy? So the whole thing with coronavirus, I should preface by saying I am not an epidemiologist, but I have been following the data extraordinarily closely. And I think that there is a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation because if you look at the mainstream media, and I'm a subscriber to all the major newspapers and a big consumer of the mainstream media, you see a lot of very selective reporting where they will blow up and say, so many new cases today, death rate at all-time highs. Whereas that is really kind of not very helpful. What's really helpful is to track the trend over several days and what the curves are doing and really get an understanding of how can you look at disease on a more nuanced basis, looking at the mortality by age group and who's more at risk, who's less at risk, what is the true case fatality rate, which we still don't know, but we have good estimates for, and what are some thoughtful ways that we can all go back to work. Because I think something that you and I agree on, Guy, is that we cannot remain in lockdown forever. And once we exit the lockdown, the virus is not going to go away. It'll be with us. So then knowing that, what do we do? Right? I think that's the question.
Yeah, so I might be in agreement with you, Marcelo, but I have no problem taking the other side. And so, so let me give you the other side, and then you can perhaps argue against it, which is to say, look, this thing is deadly. This thing is killing even people in their teens every now and then, people in their 20s and 30s, people who are completely healthy. We've both received emails from friends, somebody who's a marathon runner who got taken out. So the idea that this is just the flu is extraordinarily naive. And we have to work to save lives, and saving lives means staying at home. So what is this nonsense about managing risks and going out to work and lifting lockdowns? This is just some right-wing Republican garbage to get Donald Trump reelected. How did I do?
That's fantastic. And look, I don't think you're allowed to argue a point of view unless you can argue the opposite point of view just as well, right? So I appreciate that. And as you know, we've both thought through this. So that is a very good point. People are getting sick, people are dying regardless of age. But I think what we're doing here with this very argument is we're engaged in narrow framing. If we widen the aperture a little bit, what we find out is that throughout hundreds of years since the Industrial Revolution, we have engaged in a series of trade-offs in order to get a functioning society and a functioning economy. And just to give one example, and before the listener has this knee-jerk reaction that this is a dumb analogy, please stick with me for a little bit. But about 1 million people die every year from car accidents, and that's not even counting how many people become incapacitated, maimed, or or hurt in permanent ways. That's 34,000 in the US alone. And there's a number of other deaths that we contend with from pollution, carcinogens in our environment that are a result of the prosperity that we enjoy and all the material things that we've surrounded ourselves with. So, given that this coronavirus is not going away, and there are four other coronaviruses that are endemic to the population and they circulate every year, this will probably become the fifth one. This is sort of, I've heard this from every epidemiologist that I follow. I haven't heard a single epidemiologist say otherwise. Then this seems to me like it'll be just another risk that we will have to manage the same way that we wear seatbelts, for example. We will have to wear masks and we will have to wash our hands and we will have to practice a measure of social distancing for the foreseeable future. So it seems to me that we will have to face this reality that we cannot remain in lockdown forever and we cannot remain in a shutdown economy or a big parts of the economy shut down forever. So my contention is let's come up with creative ideas instead on how we can manage the risk, because we don't have a marketplace of ideas right now for managing the risk. Right now, we are all panicked. We are all in this government mandated lockdown, and you cannot come up with creative solutions for this problem unless we start really coming out of this panic mode and experimenting.
Yeah. And so I've received this response, so I'll give it to you. Oh, you callous human being, Marcelo, how can you play dice with human lives? These people are our grandmothers and grandfathers. These are members of our societies. And you just want to put their lives at risk by allowing people to go back to work. How can you do that?
Yeah, and there's also the additional version of that, which is Marcelo, you are privileged and you get to work from home. Why don't you go work as a nurse or as a grocery store worker? And then tell me how you feel about going back to work. And yeah, I'm very sensitive to that. And let me tell you, I would be more than willing to expose myself in those scenarios because I think that we have to have courage as a society and face this problem. I don't think it's going to go away at any point. People are hanging their hats on two things, a therapeutic and a vaccine. If you listen to the folks working on therapeutics and vaccines, they both seem like they're going to take at least several months for a therapeutic at best. We may never get one. And for a vaccine, it'll take at least a year and a half, maybe two. And again, we may never get a vaccine. So I'm curious for those advocating a continued lockdown or a lockdown forever, at what point, like what is the delimiting line? What would you need to be able to feel comfortable? And so a lot of people tell me testing. And so we just passed a bill in the United States, I think it's $480 billion, and 25 billion of that is for testing. Now, assuming that a test costs $200, which I think is a lot, between $100 for the lab technician and $100 for the cost of the test, which again I think is way overstated. That gets us about 125 million tests. That's a good start. Right now in the US, for context, we're doing about 1 million tests a week. I think a little bit more right now, maybe 1.5 million tests a week is the current run rate. And so, as far as exposing the grandparents, which was the initial point that you made, my mother is 70 years old. I have a 4-year-old boy. She loves to see him. And I told her, Mom, be very careful. This disease is pretty bad for people over 50. It's not very bad for people under 50 who don't have any comorbidities, right? In terms of diabetes and obesity, that sort of thing. And she said, I totally understand the risk. I'm willing to take the risk because for me, the cost benefit analysis is I'd rather see my grandson. I'm going crazy here by myself at home. And I'd rather see my grandson. So there's an element of personal responsibility here. Unless you've been living under a rock, I think everybody at this point knows that it's risky. But again, we all have to live with trade-offs. I'll tell you a funny story, Guy. I'm a big fan of thinking in terms of base rate probabilities. I was on an airplane a few years ago, and when we landed, the guy next to me did the sign of the cross because he was very thankful that we didn't die in the airplane, right? So he's like, oh, thank God we landed, we're safe. And I thought to myself, I wonder if he does the sign of the cross every time he drives, because when he drives, he has this illusion of control. But it turns out driving, as you know, is many orders of magnitude riskier than flying. And so we tend not to understand these risks very well and the probability of these risks. And I feel that in many cases, we are panicked to an extreme with this new risk that has just faced us, this alien invasion of this virus, if you will. And I think that we have to think a little bit more mathematically and analytically and really take obvious precautions like wearing a mask, not touching your face, washing your hands, etc., but get on with life in many situations and in many cases because we cannot remain locked down forever.
Yeah, so I can't help seeing how it plays into our predisposed notions of, well, I guess you said it, personal responsibility. So there is a view of the world, which I would say is kind of like the socialist view that the state is responsible for taking care of you. Nothing that happens is really, to a very large degree, your own responsibility. And if things go wrong, then it's up to the state to help. And if you think of your average union worker in Las Vegas or in New York City, they're just waiting for the statements from their leaders as to what to do. And so it plays into the hands of someone like the governor of New York State to take enormous powers and to really use it to strengthen their political hand. The other side, for some reason, up to now, has not been given much play and has been presented in American politics, I think, as of the thoughts of some crazy right-wing, always Trump supporters, which is, life, as you put it, I guess I find myself wanting to restate it, which is that life is risky. Who said we can get through our lives without a certain amount of personal courage, without a certain amount of personal responsibility? I think that your point is when you cross the road, you take a certain amount of personal responsibility. You're not going to step in front of a car. You also take personal responsibility. You take the risk that a car comes out of nowhere and still runs over you because they drive onto the sidewalk or something like that. But nobody seems to be advocating that point of view yet. And I guess, so that was a statement, but here's the question. It seems to me that we have rule by doctors right now, where all they care about is this concept of maximum safety from the virus, and they're not playing the trade-offs. But for some reason, the politicians aren't really expressing the trade-offs either. Why is that?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and that's a very good question. I created a list of about 85 epidemiologists on Twitter so that I could gather information from the best. And I tried engaging with them on some of these trade-offs. And the only response I got was, oh, you're talking about the trolley problem, which is this classic problem in ethics where you have a trolley coming down a set of tracks. And on the tracks split in two. On the left, you have 5 people. On the right, you have 1 person, and you are in charge of switching which track the trolley goes onto. And if you pull the lever, the trolley diverts from killing 5 people instead and only kills 1 person, should you pull the lever. And if you pull the lever, you're sort of guilty of murdering 1 person. If you do not pull the lever, you are not guilty of murdering 5 people because the trolley was going to go there anyway. So it's a very tough problem. But I think that that's exactly what we're dealing with here, is to put it in very crude terms, right? Very, very crude terms. And I apologize if this is offensive, but let's think again very rationally. If the case fatality rate for this virus is, let's call it 0.5%, and that seems to be an upper bound on what this is. That's 5 times worse than the seasonal flu, but it's 0.5%. Are we saving 0.5% with this severe lockdown potentially, which we're not, because that's what we're getting right now, is we're still seeing these people die despite the lockdown. And are we then damaging an economy and the other 99.5%? So there is a real trade-off here. And again, we have chosen in society to have many trade-offs. Now, the doctors, you're right, they are the man with the hammer. They seem to have this very one-dimensional view. And I'm talking more about the epidemiologists, where they're sort of a one-trick pony. Their response to everything is, let's shut it down because that is what I learned in epidemiology school. And that's how we get the reproductive rate of the virus to below 1, et cetera. The people who I think are more thoughtful about this are the people who straddle these multiple disciplines. They are epidemiologists or doctors, perhaps, but they're also politicians. So Dr. Scott Gottlieb is one of them, and Dr. Fauci is another one. They seem to have a much more helpful message, which is, listen, we have to stratify by risk. And it's unfortunate that very few people actually watch the coronavirus task force press conferences every day. I get it that it's not pleasant to watch Trump speak. I don't like it either, but I just fast forward to Fauci and I listen to Fauci and Deborah Birx, and he's had a very consistent message all along, which is we cannot treat Nebraska similar to how we treat New York. We're not going to open up everything at the same time. We're going to do it very slowly and carefully. Yes, this virus is going to stay around. I guarantee you that it's going to come back in the fall. We're going to have to manage this risk, et cetera. And Scott Gottlieb the same has had the same message. So as far as the politicians, I think you'll agree with this guy that Cuomo has done a great job so far. I think he's now going a little bit too far. And same thing, we were having this discussion on Twitter about the governor of Washington State, where their epidemic curve seems to be coming down consistently. And it looks very much like European countries that have chosen to reopen, like Denmark, for example, has already reopened its schools much earlier in the curve. Austria has reopened, the Czech Republic, etc. Why is Washington State, for example, not talking more forcefully about this? And is it just politics, right? Is it just because he's a Democratic governor trying to earn political points and trying to perhaps hurt the Trump potential reelection? Which by the way, I have no stake in this game whatsoever. I'm not a Trump supporter at all, and I don't like to think in terms of politics. I like to think in terms of science-based facts. So, but why is that, right? Why are these politicians taking these very strident views based on political lines rather than science-based decisions? And that's something that I find very frustrating.
Yeah, and I think it challenges a whole bunch of people to actually start thinking independently, whereas for a large part of the last God knows how many years, you didn't have to think independently. You could just take a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, a couple of people who are thinking independently that I just want you to address briefly. Mike Burry, whom we both know as both a doctor and a highly successful investor, the subject of The Big Short. He kind of did not a Twitter storm, but like a 2-week sort of flourish on Twitter, and he's just said goodbye. He said everything he's got to say. And the other is Eric Weinstein. Maybe you can address those two, but also, well, address those two. Then I have another question for you.
You know, I saw a little bit of what Mike Burry wrote. I didn't follow it very closely, so I don't think I'm in a good position to opine there. What I find interesting, but I think generally we agree that we do have to manage this risk and reopen society, and we can't remain in this panicked state forever. As far as Eric Weinstein, he has this very interesting idea of idea suppression, that there are certain things that are taboo to talk about. So what I find very interesting about him is he's willing to have a porn star on his show. He's willing to engage in conversations that are very much taboo. And I think we've lost a lot of that in society. It's become, and by the way, this is back to your earlier point, Guy, we've become snowflakes, I think. We've become coddled. We've become very, very fragile because probably, I think, we've been in a state of peaceful prosperity for many decades, right? We haven't had pestilence, famines, wars, all these types of tragedies that past generations had to deal with. I'm reading a biography of Winston Churchill right now, and it is just absolutely shocking how different life was back then. It was absolutely normal for him to get into a boat and spend 5 days going to South Africa and going into a war and having bullets fired at him and take out his sword and gut the enemy and see the guts spill out and write books about it and then travel to another war zone. And this was all sort of part and parcel of being at the head of the British Empire back then. And I'm glad we don't live in that world anymore. I'm glad we live in a peaceful prosperity. But how do we retain the ability to engage in these difficult conversations, engage in controversial topics, and deal with adversity and have personal responsibility and have independent thinking when we have been in this peaceful prosperity for such a long time? And to your point, have had the quote unquote authorities just telling us our opinions, right? Instead of coming up with our opinions ourselves.
Yeah. And, there was a meme that was going around at the beginning of the acceleration in the US, which said, our forefathers were called to go to war for us. All we have to do is sit on the couch. We can do this. And actually, that's not the right meme, because it's not sitting on the couch. It's getting up off the couch and saying, hey, I'm going to take a tram, I'm going to go to the shops, and taking those risks is actually what we're required to do now to get on with our lives. It's worth saying that people say that you're in a position where you can advocate for people taking risks, but I think we're in the lucky place where we can continue our work even though we're cooped up at home. But people like us are telling people who cannot do their work, people who are losing their jobs at restaurants, losing their jobs in all sorts of service industries at hotels and the like. We're telling them to stay at home and not do their jobs for everyone's safety while we continue to do ours. I think that's an enormous injustice. And another injustice, by the way, just forgive me for getting onto the same bandwagon that you're on. I find it obscene that the state will tell an elderly person what risks they can and can't take. That an elderly person might be in their mid 80s, they might already have a degenerative disease, and they might say, I'm happy to take every risk of seeing my grandchildren because I'd rather see my grandchildren, play with them, hold them in my arms, and take the risk of dying from this disease than perhaps never seeing them again. And that is something for each individual to decide. It's what I tweeted out was that so long as we have hospital capacity, it's an individual decision, not something that should be mandated. But let me get on to one last question, really, because we wanted to keep this short and we're already at like 20 minutes or so, which is you've been, it seems to me, a really effective user of Twitter. And for the listeners' interest, at Marcelo P. Lima is Marcelo's Twitter account, which is well worth following. And Marcelo will even engage with you if you say intelligent things to him. And if you are a good enough user of Twitter, you can actually pull up Marcelo's lists, or you just take that address and you do /lists. And Marcelo has lists on Zendesk, on Wix, on Graphene, epidemiology, and various other topics, which are well worth following. I've not yet followed any. But Marcelo, tell me about your use of Twitter, how and why you use it, whether you think you're using it effectively, and how you're using it in the discussion over coronavirus.
Yep. Guy, so I'd love to answer that. Just one little thing before that. I love what you said before about this hurting the small person, the small businessman, the solo entrepreneur. And that is something that worries me a lot. We spent a decade after the last great financial crisis with very slow recovery in terms of employment, very low wage growth. Some people were just about getting back on their legs right after the great financial crisis, and then they get whacked with this again. And so now we're printing trillions of dollars. The stock market is bizarrely resilient, despite the fact that we're facing this incredible recession with tens of millions of people unemployed. And we are literally mandating that people not work and not be able to earn a living. There was a story of a lady in California that just decided to open up her hair salon, and she said, "Look, I'm pregnant. I have to support several kids. I was unable to get any stimulus money because I didn't qualify." And so at some point, people will revolt. And I think, frankly, rightly so, because there is a big element here of personal responsibility and let me figure out a way to do this responsibly. And again, if you are very risk averse, you can choose to remain quarantined. I'm not advocating that people expose themselves if they don't feel comfortable with it. But to move on to the Twitter question, I got into Twitter because a mutual friend of ours mentioned me on Twitter many years ago. And for about a year, I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. And I couldn't really find a voice. And I started just observing. And then I started following really interesting people. And what I discovered is, I think Bill Gurley from Benchmark, the venture capitalist, said this. He said, some of the top experts in their fields are on Twitter. And it's one of the best interest groups ever. So it's sort of like a chess club, if you will, but for any type of interest, not just chess. And you can choose whatever interest or sets of interests you're interested in. And you can find some of the best people being very articulate on Twitter. So it is, I think, a superpower to be able to use it effectively and interact with people, because for me, it's been a huge accelerant of learning. It's been a huge accelerant of meeting interesting people. I think at this point, I've met more interesting people through Twitter than just about anywhere else. So yeah, it's truly phenomenal.
how does that work? How do you meet people on Twitter? What is the difference between the people who use Twitter really well and the people who don't? And so, what is it? What are the kind of is it got to do with what you post? Has it got to do with responding to other people's posts? Do you respond to people who you don't know and you just met through Twitter, or do you only respond to people that you've met in real life? And how did you develop the persona on Twitter that manages to do all of that?
I frankly just do what I like to do, and so I'll respond to anyone. I'll engage with anyone, and a lot of people don't engage back. I'm very frustrated, like I said, that the epidemiologists don't seem to engage, and I'm asking them very, I think, normal, regular, intelligent questions, and they just don't respond, and I don't know why. But a lot of people do, and I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I traveled to a city, and I said on Twitter, "Hey, I'm traveling here, and I would love to meet some people," and I got several responses, and I had lunch with a very interesting person. I had breakfast with another very interesting person, and I made some friends that way. And that's I've done that several times. And so I just think it's a great place to meet people with common interests. Now, I do feel that more people should be on Twitter, and more people, because a lot of people have intelligent things to say who are not on Twitter. And that I think is kind of frustrating. But hopefully, I've seen a lot of new users, and I know that their user growth has accelerated recently. So hopefully the community continues to grow.
I think that of all the social media, I find Twitter to be the most, in a certain way, honest platform. It doesn't pretend. For example, I think many of us felt duped by Facebook in that it pretended to give us privacy that wasn't actually there. And it pretended to give us a sense that we were just sharing something with small groups of our friends. And it turned out that depended very much on your privacy settings. And a lot of us left Facebook and went on to messaging platforms like WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook anyway, but it's a different sense of privacy. And Twitter doesn't do that. It kind of pretty much says up front, you're sharing with the general public. And I kind of like that. But I'm hoping that you can give me I'm curious to know what you think of the following. So I've actually, the ads that Twitter shows me annoy me. If I see an ad that annoys me, I block the user because I think that that's a kind of an interruption that I don't appreciate. Another thing that I've started doing is if somebody puts up these GIFs of a reaction, so anybody who in a certain way is polluting, is not adding signal and information, and they're just creating noise, I block them. How do you deal with that?
Well, I have a different set of problems with Twitter, I guess, but I agree with you that one of the most effective ways is to either mute people or block people that are just not engaging in intelligent conversation. In some of these recent tweets that I made, I had, very few, but I had a few people say, "Oh, you're completely stupid and you're a moron, obviously, blah, blah, blah." And that's, maybe I am a moron, but that's not a very helpful way to engage in conversation. So what I would prefer is if somebody said, "Listen, this is why I think you're
Yeah.
wrong. Let me show you some data as to why you're wrong," and that is extremely helpful. There's nothing that I like more than to be proven wrong, because that's how I move forward. I love to have my best ideas destroyed and my best constructs challenged, because that to me is very interesting. It's very interesting when there's an idea that I've come to behold and think that it's a good idea. Turns out it's a bad idea. I find that actually very interesting.
Yeah, so two things. One is that the rabbis from the Talmud loved it when people changed their minds, because when you change your mind, it means that you're growing. And just to your prior point, again, ad hominem attacks, attacking the individual rather than their ideas, is just not productive. And again, I actually wish that Twitter had some tools where you could just identify all the people who engage in ad hominem attacks and suppress them for 2 or 3 months and just basically say, look, if you engage in certain kinds of behavior, I'm not going to shut you out because I don't want to create an echo chamber, but you're going to be muted for 3 months and then you'll come online. Perhaps your behavior will have changed. So, just in terms of, and I guess this is my closing question to you, when do you keep Twitter open all day? Do you go to it certain times of the day? Is there a danger that you're spending too much time on it? How do you manage that?
I try to have blocks of deep work where I leave my phone on do not disturb. I don't check my email. I don't check anything else, and I'm just reading a lot of times, or listening to something or watching something. And Twitter is very sporadic, so it's I do it a few times a day, and I tend to do it in chunks. So yeah, I don't find it very productive to leave it on all the time because that's really not being productive for me, right? For me, being productive is right now, for example, we're in earnings season. So what I'm doing is I'm following the earnings of every company out there, whether I own it or not, whether I have an interest in it or not, just because I want to get a sense of what's happening in the real economy and what companies are saying. And so that's sort of my day nowadays. And I'll open Twitter every once in a while if I need a break. And frequently, it's like, as you know, Guy, it's like drinking from a fire hose because if you have a very good curated list of people that you follow, of very intelligent people, you open Twitter and it's a lot of signal and it's very little noise. And
Yeah.
that's what I like about it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Marcelo, I just want to rewind the book on Churchill, Winston Churchill. Which biography were you talking about?
So I'm reading the recent one, I think by Andrew Roberts. I do not recommend it, and the reason I do not recommend it is I think he goes into much more detail than I would have liked. So he'll say things like Winston Churchill's weekly dinners with his cabinet and what was on the menu, and I'm like, okay, but I what I really want to know is sort of the big picture. So it's a very very big book. It's very long, but I'm plowing through it, and I just find that Churchill is an absolutely fascinating character. Dealt with a lot of adversity, dealt with a lot of problems. I'm not done with the biography yet, but that is something that's known about this character. And I think that we should all learn from people who have dealt with adversity and issues like that, and try to build more resiliency into our lives and learn to deal with these huge unexpected tragedies like this coronavirus, which is something that has happened throughout the history of mankind.
Yeah, Marcelo, there's so much more we could discuss, but we want to keep this down. I'm going to give you the chance for a closing thought. And I've already shared how to get in touch with you, but any thoughts about how to engage with Marcelo Lima in the world, and closing thoughts for the listener?
Well, closing thoughts, I would say try to analyze as much raw data as you can. Don't rely on the narrative that's being fed to you by the media. As much as I love the mainstream media, I think there's an idea out there. Michael Crichton, the author, came up with this thing. He calls it the Murray Gell-Mann Amnesia effect. Murray Gell-Mann is a physicist. And it was because Murray Gell-Mann is a specialist, and he opens up the newspaper and he says, when I read a story in the newspaper about something that I'm very much an expert in, I completely disagree with the reporter. I read the story and I'm like, I can't believe this guy's getting it so wrong. And then I turn the page and it's a topic about which I know nothing. Let's say it's like Palestine or something. And I read the article with intense interest and I'm like, wow, this is so thoughtful and well articulated. And so I had this amnesia effect where the topic that I'm an expert in, I know is very wrong. And the topic that I'm not an expert in, I assume is very right. And so I think we should all be much more skeptical about what we read in mainstream media, because having developed a little bit of expertise in a few topics, I became much more skeptical in recent years and much more inclined to really analyze as much the source documents, the original data, look at alternative viewpoints, because I think that that's an important thing to do as a member of society.
Yeah, and we're in a world right now where many of those authority figures are actually wrong. It's amazing because things are changing so fast and we need so much new insight and information. Authority figures are standing up and saying things that turn out to be complete garbage. In a certain way, it's never been a better time for independent thinking and certain people are coming to the fore. And I would argue that Eric Weinstein is one and Marcelo Lima is another. You're certainly an independent thinker, and it's really fun. It's actually, Marcelo, what I'd say is Twitter has brought us closer because I can see what's on your mind. It's really, really fun, even though we're separated by time and distance. So thank you so much for joining. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Guy. It's a super pleasure. Thank you very much.